Blomcast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the Blomcast, the podcast that looks at changing points in history. And first of all, a shout out to our listeners in Japan. I just received the Japanese copy of Nature's Mutiny, which I'm inordinately pleased about, especially because it's also beautifully designed. But it's not this book we are talking about today. I'm very excited to welcome in the Blomcast Musa Al-Gharbi. Musa, welcome to the Blomcast.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Now, this brilliant book that you've written, We Have Never Been Woke, which you're just publicizing, now that begins with a bit of backstory. And I always think it's nice to get a feeling for a person. I also think actually that as a scholarly principle, I've written about the Enlightenment, and I think the touching point between biography and work is something that is very often underestimated, and you can know so much of people's work by getting an impression of who they are and where they come from. I also incidentally think that's sort of important in the humanities and for historians like me, because I'm always more comfortable when I know who the author is, who has written something, where that person stands, where basically not even trying to raise a veil of objectivity. So Musa, the book that we're discussing is actually your doctoral dissertation. Now, and it doesn't happen very often that doctoral dissertations not only get publishers and prestigious publishers, but actually get auctioned off and are then publicized with a professional publicist, etc. That is a huge success, but it is also, and congratulations to that, but it is also, I think, very much a sign of our times because of the critique that you're mounting at. But before we get into this critique, and before I ask you to comment a little bit about the life that has led you to these positions and to this point that you're in, we are recording this episode a few weeks after Donald Trump's victory. And that speaks very much to your work. Indeed, you already made comments like that about the first Donald Trump election. I'm a professional journalist. I try to be relatively well informed. I try to listen to a lot of people who I think are better informed than I am. I try to read and keep up with the news, etc. And as far as I am concerned, nobody saw this victory coming quite as sweepingly and unequivocally as it then came. What is happening in a country when one half of the country has completely lost all ability to understand the other half, to the extent that they're in complete cloud cuckoo land about something as predictable as an election?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I showed in an essay I wrote after the election is that that a lot of the popular narratives that we hear in the news media and in academia about how Trump won in 2024, that it was racism and sexism and things like this. A lot of these narratives are just kind of pretty strongly falsified by just the available empirical data of how people actually voted and whose votes actually shifted and so on and so forth. But one of the striking things is, as you noted, I wrote this same essay basically in 2020 and in 2016, producing the same kind of charts, showing the same kind of trend lines that have been going on for roughly a decade. For more than a decade now, actually, since 2010. But it's been really hard for people to process it. And one of the big problems that we have, one of the reasons why why we can read tons of smart scholars and smart journalists and still be completely out of sync with kind of what's happening, is because we actually have this problem with the constitution of a lot of our knowledge fields, where almost everyone who takes part in these fields is on the blue line of charts. Almost all of us are Democrats. Almost all of us are liberals. And this becomes a problem because when we try to analyze anything that we think of as bad, for instance, our starting point isn't to think, well, how are the blue line people driving this problem? how are the blue line people responsible for this issue, we start by assuming that it's the red line people who are responsible. And we typically try to explain anything that we think of as bad in terms of deficits or pathologies that are supposed to hold among the red line people. And I have a talk where I show this with respect to polarization, for instance, because a lot of us think polarization is bad. When we try to understand polarization, we assume that the red line people are driving it, and we have these narratives about how the red line, we're more polarized on race because the red line people are becoming more racist, or we're more polarized on gender because they're becoming more misogynistic. But one of the striking things is we can look at our own charts, the charts that we ourselves produce, the charts that we ourselves put forward that allegedly show that the red line is driving the polarization, and it's clearly the blue line that's driving the polarization. You can look at the chart. It's this kind of glaring error. And in fact, I wrote an essay for an academic journal, The American Sociologist, called Race and the Race for the White House, on social research in the age of Trump. And this is what I showed, is like there are these kind of glaring errors that are getting routinely published about Trump and Trump voters, that not only the scholars miss them, but also the peer reviewers and the editors and the people who are sharing the works and the people who are citing the works. It's these kind of obvious, blatant, once you see it, you can't not see it. It's not like a matter of interpretation kind of thing. It's like in the case that I just said, like the blue line is clearly driving the chart. The red line has, if anything, become marginally more racially progressive.
It's these people's business to be right. There's a lot of money riding on what they say, certainly the next time round. So don't they have an interest to see that themselves, what you are describing? I mean, there's a lot of very bright professional people.
Well, one of the problems, though, too, is another structural problem of the profession is that no one is really held accountable for being wrong. So Phil Tetlock, for instance, had this great book. He's a psychologist. He has a book called Expert Political Judgment. And what he tried to show is because most of the time when journalists and so on make predictions, no one ever checks back to see, well, were they true or not? And so he did this. He spent 10 years having experts make predictions and comparing them to chance. And he compared them to chance by having a monkey throw darts at a board. He would ask the monkey, what's going to happen with the price of gold in 3 months? And there would be a bunch of options on the wall. And the monkey would throw a dart. Okay, so it turns out that experts, on balance, were no better than a dart-throwing monkey at making predictions.
They're better paid, though.
And in some cases, they were actually worse. So if they were people who are really prestigious, people who had strong ideological axes to grind, and so on, these kinds of folks tended to be worse than a dart-throwing monkey at predicting what would happen. And so one of the problems that we have in a lot of our knowledge fields is you would think or hope that people have a strong incentive to get things right and to learn from their errors and things like this. But unfortunately, how it often works in practice is that people are just consistently wrong, but no one really holds them to account when they're wrong. And they just keep making wrong, inaccurate predictions just constantly. In Tetlock's study, again, a broad array of experts over the course of a decade, they were just wrong. But they were still viewed as prestigious and insightful folks.
They had very interesting arguments for how wrong they could be. Oh,
yes. Well, this is one of the problems is because once you're an expert, and in fact, this is one of his findings too, is that experts are actually worse at making predictions in their area of expertise than they were at making predictions about things that were not in their area of expertise. And this is because when they're speaking on their areas of expertise, they find all of these reasons to, like, if the available evidence runs contrary to their priors, they find all sorts of reasons to dismiss it. Like, oh, well, it seems like X is actually happening. Well, let me tell you, actually, I can go back to the treaty of whatever, and blah, and so they find some reason to. And then similarly, when their predictions are wrong, because they are very knowledgeable, they're very good at producing rationalizations for why they were wrong. How they were basically right, even though they were not right. And and so this is a big problem with our knowledge fields, is that unfortunately the incentives do not push people to be really accountable for their wrongness.
This question of elite accountability is something that is sloshing around at the moment. I've seen a very insightful interview with Rahm Emanuel, of all people, where he said, the ruling elite was not held accountable for the disaster of the Iraq War or for the financial crash. And this was terrible malgovernance, and we screwed up. I just want to quickly try out an idea on you, because it's sort of with me a lot at this moment, because of course in Europe as well we have a lot of far right-wing populist victories. And what you often hear in liberal circles at dinner tables or on podia in public discussions is these people, meaning people who vote for Trump, etc., vote against their own interest. And with the implication, how can you be so stupid? I always find that remarkable, because it sort of denies them equal rationality, but also it seems to me we found fundamental misunderstanding of their interests. It seems to me these people are angry. These people want to get rid of the elite. They want to damage the elite that they feel screwed around with or by. And whoever does that for them is their sword. And if they have to pay some more taxes, or if the inflation rises due to tariffs, then that's a price they're willing to pay. And that, to me, is something fundamentally rational, though I politically don't agree with it.
I mean, one of the striking things, as you said, is like when we're confronted with the reality that we make these strong assumptions about what other people's interests are. They seem to disagree with us about what their interests are. There are kind of two conclusions that we could draw. One of them is that, maybe we don't understand their interests as well as we thought we did, which would be the intellectually humble response. But that's not the choice we choose to make. Typically, we assume that they don't know their own interests, and that and actually this goes awry in a lot of cases. So, for instance, with respect to race and policing issues, according to a lot of academics and left-leaning journalists, what would be in Black people's interests would be to have radically reduced policing, to let people out of prisons, things like this. But that's not how Black people understand their interests typically. Black people actually want better policing, sure, but more policing. Black people are not.
And that is backed up by surveys, I suppose.
If you look at nationally representative polls and surveys, and actually the reasons are, and in fact, the people who are most supportive of things like decarceration or defunding the police are actually relatively affluent white liberals. When you look at polls and surveys, Black people do not support this, and the reason why Black people have a different understanding of this, according to is that for one, a lot of African Americans have actual public safety concerns. They have real concerns about public safety and public order. A lot of their communities suffer a lot from various forms of crime, and including and this is the case where elites often get this thing wrong, where they'll in elite circles they'll say things like, "Oh, well, don't call the cops and get someone arrested for something like stealing a bike. It's just stuff. You can just replace the stuff. You can't replace the person if they get killed or if they get a criminal record," and so on and so forth. But the stuff matters to people sometimes in a deep way. Like if you're trying to put food on your table for your family, and the bike is how you get to work, and someone takes your bike, that's a big problem for your ability to provide for your family, for your ability to keep your lights on and the roof over your head. And you can't just buy a new bike necessarily. We can just buy a new bike, but that's not necessarily the position that other people are in. And so if their property gets damaged or destroyed or taken, that is a big problem that upsets the course of their life, and sometimes even causes great harm for them in a practical way. And so, and the same thing with decarceration. According to a lot of, relatively affluent liberals, we assume that the reason why we have this large prison population is that the prisons are just full of nonviolent drug offenders and people who are just using a little bit of drugs for themselves, and they got. But that's actually not the case. So the Prison Policy Initiative has a graph that they produce every year called the whole pie. And I would recommend people check it out. What you can see whether you're looking at the federal level, the state level, local jails, it doesn't matter. The majority of people, about 2/3 of people who are in prisons or jails in the United States, are there for violent crime, rapes, assaults, murders, things like this.
Just a curious question from left field, but the US prison population is so much higher than the prison population in comparative cultures. Do you think, comparative countries, do you think that is due to the fact that American society is just so much more violent? Or is the justice system simply better at detecting crime and therefore...
I think we are probably more violent. We're also more diverse than a lot of places as well, and there's kind of a lot of different factors. And so, as Putnam and some others have argued, like diversity has a lot of positives to it, but it also has a lot of trade-offs in terms of reduced social solidarity, increased suspicion towards others, hostility and aggression across. And I think we actually, given our levels of diversity in this country, I think we actually. In some ways manage them pretty well, but in other ways, but I think, but there are some challenges. But so to just finish off this point, when Black people and less affluent people hear things about closing prisons, they understand that when you close the prison, these people aren't going to be moving to the Upper West Side of Manhattan. They're not moving to wealthy white neighborhoods and stuff. What's going to happen if you close the prisons is a bunch of violent offenders are going to be moved into their neighborhoods, and so this is a problem. This is something that obviously they're not super keen on, and so like for a lot of white progressives, then when we see that African Americans are not cool with abolishing the prisons and defunding the police, we go, oh, they don't understand their own interests. And it's like, no, you don't understand their interests. You have no idea of the kinds of challenge that ordinary people are facing, especially people who live in these communities. You're not the one who's going to be paying the cost for these policies, and so on and so forth. And you can go forth, down the line for a lot of these less affluent people, minority populations, religious minorities, and so on that have been drifting towards the Republican Party. Progressives just have a poor understanding of their interests in many cases, not just the sense in which they have an interest in trying to hold to account or punish or purge these elites who are looking down on them and not respecting them and so on. I think that's part of the story. But then even on some of the more granular issues around things like foreign policy, immigration, policing, and so on, progressives have these strong priors about what's in the interests of Hispanics, Latinos, Muslims, and Arabs, and so on, that a lot of these voters just disagree with them.
Now, because I know that we're going to be challenged about this, certainly in the comments, you speak of Black people, you speak of African Americans like they're one big group, all of whom have the same opinions about decarceration, etc. I'm assuming we just can draw a bell curve here and say most people in the middle.
Yeah. I'm just talking about median opinion within the Black community.
Yeah. Okay. No, just to clarify that for any listeners who are getting a bit restive.
Yeah, I mean, relatively affluent, highly educated Black people, for instance, have views that are pretty close to relatively affluent, highly educated white,
exactly.
And so on and so forth.
Now, Musa, let's just take a step back, because you have a very interesting, very atypical career, and you are not shy talking about that. You have a long, detailed intellectual biography on your website, where you tell about this. So I'm assuming that we can talk about that. You come from a military family, and most of the men in your family, and even some of the women in the family, have been in the military, and actively so. Tell me about that, and about what kind of an upbringing that was.
Both my mom and my stepdad were in the Army. My biological father was in the Army. My grandfather fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. A lot of my cousins and my half siblings were in the Army. I had a twin brother who was in the Army who died in Afghanistan in 2010. I grew up in military communities are interesting, both because the military has long been one of the places that really pushes for diversity and inclusion and things like this in a way that's like more aggressive than the rest of the society, but I think in a way that's less dysfunctional than the way a lot of other institutions do it.
You have to pull your weight.
And, the communities are integrated, you're side by side with people in the barracks, you're side by side with people. And if you live on the fort, you have the fort housing, it's not segregated by race or anything like that in the way that cities like New York are. They and the schools are kind of and so I had a lot of friends from all sorts of different backgrounds. A lot of my friends actually spent a lot of time overseas. I didn't, because Fort Huachuca was one of those places where once you get stationed there, you're there. So
you remained there.
Yeah. So my parents didn't really do a lot of traveling, but a lot of my peers before their parents got stationed at Fort Huachuca did a lot of traveling. And Huachuca, I should add, is the main intelligence base for the Army. So when Chelsea Manning did the leaks to WikiLeaks, it was while stationed at Fort Huachuca, and so on and so forth.
Yes, and so they don't tend to shuffle people around a lot.
Yeah, and so both of my parents were military intelligence, and that's maybe not incidental to some of the ways that I approach research. So, for instance, in the 2016 election, in the military intelligence communities, there's this activity called red teaming, which is because lives are on the line based on whether or not a plan is accurate. What they'll do sometimes is they'll have one team draw up a plan, and then they'll have another team who had nothing to do with drawing up that plan, a red team, basically approach that plan as a hostile actor, basically saying, like, this is the dumbest plan I've ever seen. If you do this, you're all going to die. And so basically what you do is you assume the opposite of what you want to be true, and then you aggressively look for evidence for why the thing you don't want to happen will likely happen. And so during the 2016 election, I was surprised that there was this kind of strong consensus, unanimous consensus among experts that not only was Hillary Clinton going to win, but that it was going to be a blowout and that the Republicans were going to be destroyed for a generation and so on and so forth. And as someone who studies knowledge, I was really interested in this. And so I decided to do a red teaming exercise. I decided to look like, well, is there a reason to think that everyone is wrong? Is there a reason to think that actually Trump could win? And so I aggressively dedicated myself to looking for evidence for that, for the opposite proposition of what I wanted to be true. And to my shock and dismay, I found that there was tons of reasons actually to think that Trump could probably win. And so I spent most of the 2016 cycle trying to urge people to take Trump's prospects more seriously, largely in vain. But this is a case in which, again, kind of growing up in a military family, in a military community, military intelligence circles, and so on, actually shaped the way I go about my research in a way that maybe differentiates me from some of my colleagues.
Your first wish for your own future was to become a Catholic priest.
Yeah, and I was already kind of a weirdo in that way, because again.
But weirdos can be a good thing.
Yeah. So again, like almost everyone, pretty much everyone in my family was. So I was already kind of unusual in that I was drawn to these kind of spiritual and intellectual questions, consumed by them really at an early age. And then I had a crisis of faith, and I became an atheist for a while. But even then, some of these questions, I shifted to being a philosopher, because some of these questions that I had about the structure and nature of reality and the meaning of life, I still was consumed by these questions. And so I tried to pursue them without the God stuff, basically, as a philosopher. And then, my research interest changed again after my brother died. Before that, I had thought that I wasn't really interested in politics per se.
He was your twin brother.
Yeah, my twin brother. Yeah.
Which is, I think, very important because, twins are very close.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
This was a crisis for you when he died in Afghanistan.
And for my family. So, for instance, I had been planning on going to New York University. I had just been applying to universities from community college. And I got into NYU and University of Arizona and a couple of other philosophy programs. And I was initially going to go to NYU because they have some really good metaphysicians there. But then after my brother's death, I decided to go to University of Arizona instead to be close to my family who live in to help my parents through this time. And then my own research interest evolved because I realized that actually this stuff that I was writing off, this politics and things like this that I had thought was not important. I thought it was people getting distracted by the little things, and I was focused on the big things, And I came to realize that, politics is more important than I thought, was important in different ways than I thought. So I shifted my focus away from metaphysics to doing applied social epistemology. So what do we know in virtue of what? With the focus on national security and foreign policy questions, with the idea of trying to help other families avoid the kind of tragedy and suffering that my own family was going through. And then gradually my work on knowledge continued to expand. Like at the time I completed my master's thesis, like my argument of my master's thesis was like, if epistemologists want to make progress on some of these questions that we ask, there's a component to some of these questions that we can fruitfully engage with from the armchair, just thinking about it. But also some of these questions really turn on empirical matters, and so epistemologists, if they want to actually make progress on some of these questions, they need to engage more with the best available empirical evidence about how people actually reason and think and how we process information together and things like this. And then gradually, and so when I applied to PhD programs later, after a very tumultuous and strange journey, I decided, well, heck, if this is what I think, maybe I should be a social scientist instead of a philosopher. And so I applied to sociology programs, specifically programs that were good on sociology of knowledge, with the idea of investigating these same questions using different tools and different methods. And so and then gradually my questions about knowledge and kind of expanded. And so one way to understand what this book is it's a study of the political economy of the knowledge professions, basically.
And that is a fascinating thing, and I will really want to jump into that. But there's just one piece of the puzzle that I want to come back to, because next to your research interest evolving, your spiritual interests also evolved, and you converted to Islam. Tell me about that. I mean, that seems a spiritually rich gesture, but you could also see it as a gesture of provocation. How did you come to convert to Islam from atheism, from Catholicism? I mean, I'm saying this as someone who's been religious once himself, and I think I can follow some of those emotional and spiritual and intellectual processes. And so, how did you come to that step? What was that journey that took you there?
Well, so basically, I mean, after I abandoned Catholicism, I spent a while. I kind of I assumed, well, if this. So the doctrine of Catholicism that ended up haunting me, the thing that ended up haunting me, is I became convinced over the course of my reading of the scriptures and studying them through. And the adjacent literatures and stuff, that Jesus probably didn't understand himself to be God. I mean, so for instance, he constantly refers to himself as the Son of Man. Ezekiel was referred to as the Son of Man as well, but God called him the Son of Man.
And also a human being in Hebrew is a Ben Adam, which means a son of man.
Yeah, to remind him that he was not God. And so Jesus adopting this term for himself, but there's so many other things. Anyway, so I came to believe that Jesus wasn't God, and that wouldn't necessarily be a problem for some strains of early Christianity. Anyway, in early Christianity, there was a lot of debate about the nature of Jesus's divinity.
You could have become a Protestant, no problem. You could have become an Anglican and believed whatever the hell you wanted.
But you couldn't become a Catholic, right?
No, you could not become a Catholic. That's really annoying for Catholics if you don't believe in the divinity of Jesus. So no.
Yeah, it totally changes the nature of the Trinity. It changes the nature of the ritual of communion.
Well, it becomes Protestantism, basically.
So in a sense, you could say I overcorrected. I assumed that if I couldn't, I couldn't be Catholic anymore in good faith, I couldn't do this life calling that I had planned to in good faith. And so I assumed not only was my specific faith tradition probably not going to work for me, but that religion in general was garbage and whatever. And so I tried to basically live a everything is permitted lifestyle of sex, drugs, and rock and roll and stuff like this for a long time. But that also didn't bring me happiness or fulfillment. It just actually made me feel empty and miserable. And more than that, I had kind of rationally convinced myself that religion was nonsense and that there was no God and all of this kind of stuff. But I couldn't make myself feel it. And so this created a kind of a problem where like I could either just ignore that feeling, which would make me basically a bad faith atheist, which is terrible of all the things to be. Or I could just say I'm like agnostic or spiritual but not religious or so on. But all of this was all of these kinds of options were intellectually and spiritually unsatisfying to me as well. And so ultimately what I ended up doing is I started looking into other faith traditions. And over the course of this journey, I ended up reading the Quran, and I became convinced that it was a prophetic work. And I was like, well, if I think the Quran is a prophetic work and I believe in God, well, that's the two things. That's the Shahada right there. Maybe I'm a Muslim. And so I looked into Islam more, and then eventually took the plunge. And I'll say, this is another thing that definitely changed my life. I mean, shortly after I converted to Islam, I met my wife and we got married. And the combination of these two things, both finding faith again and then being married and having someone who's invested, who had so much faith in you that she hitched herself to my very rickety wagon at the time, pushed me to get my life together. And so over the years that followed, I got 4 degrees in the next 5 years. I went from community college to Ivy League university, although not without severe complications. And I'll say though, now being a Muslim is another thing that probably does shift the way I do research in some ways. Like, so for instance, I think I probably do have a different orientation towards time than a lot of my colleagues.
How so?
Okay, so here's a fun quiz that I do to people sometimes because it blows their mind. So we've been talking since 2016 about foreign meddling in U.S. elections, with Russia intervening to supposedly help Donald Trump and so on. And given that we've been talking about this incessantly now for more than a decade, this should be about a decade. This should be easy. When was the last case of meddling in a U.S. presidential election that was comparable to Russia's efforts to meddle in the U.S. election in 2016?
You're asking the wrong guy.
Yeah, so I asked people this question. No one ever knows. But the wild thing is, so the case was in 1996, Bill Clinton was running for re-election against Bob Dole. Bob Dole was taking this really aggressive line against China, describing China as a major threat to U.S. interests and so on and so forth. And so China tried to swing the election in favor of Dole's opponent, Bill Clinton. The plot was discovered. The Democratic National Committee had to return hundreds of millions of dollars. Many people went to jail for colluding with China to throw the election. Some others fled the country. There was the appointment of most of the public was deeply concerned because after China tried to swing the election for Clinton, Clinton started engaging in a lot of actions that were really favorable to China, like passing these things that folded them into the global market, passing these arms deals against the advisement of federal agencies. And it turned out that these arms deals actually were shady, and so on and so forth.
Well, you got me there. I knew nothing about that.
Yeah, and most of the public, in fact, it gets even more dramatic because the person who was in charge of investigating the Chinese meddling wanted to appoint a special counsel person like Mueller in this latest round, but he was blocked at every turn by Clinton's Attorney General Janet Reno to the point where he resigned in protest. This was a big deal. It went on for years and years and years. It was covered nonstop every day. And there are even these through lines between the story. The intended beneficiary of the last foreign meddling scandal is married to the intended victim of the current one. And in fact, it was some of Bill Clinton's own actions during his second term are what helped meddling in Russia's elections, or what helped Vladimir Putin come to power. So there are all these through lines between these stories, and literally no one remembers it. And not only does no one remember it, everyone is so locked in to the premise that what's happening is new and novel and unprecedented. They're so locked into the moment. It doesn't even occur to a lot of people to even look for precedents. Like it doesn't even occur to them to check to see if there is one.
So you mean that thinking in a religious context involves always much longer continuities, and therefore you become more sensitized to continuities also in other areas.
Yeah, and so this book, for instance, one of the main contributions of this book is that it shows this period of awakening after 2010 was actually a case of something. And in fact, there were 3 previous ones going back a whole century, and so this kind of 100-year historical arc to contextualize things that are happening in the present is something that's a major contribution of this book, and it's something that a lot of other people weren't doing. But I think part of the reason why I have this orientation to kind of take a longer look into to assume that there's nothing new under the sun and that there probably are precedents for a lot of this stuff is because of my religious orientation, I suspect.
So here we are with this book. We have never been woke. Just because we're a very international podcast and we're also listened to by a lot of people who are not English native speakers, how do you understand wokeness? What is wokeism? How are we woke, or do we think we are?
So what the book doesn't do is it doesn't provide a nice, crisp, analytic definition of wokeness. And the reason I don't do that is twofold. First, because it's a much contested term, and so I think more than picking a definition and running with it, it's actually useful to surface the disagreement that people have, and to talk about the history of the term, and to talk about some of the different things that people seem to mean when they use the term. And so I do that in chapter 1. I'll circle back to that. But one reason also why I don't define the term is because there's this move that happens a lot in the discourse, which is like, if you can't define something, then you don't even know what you're talking about, and you're not talking about anything, and it's an empty moral panic. And that's wild, because that's just not the way the language works. So in my class on interpersonal communication, one thing that I like to do is I have my students define apple for me, provide the necessary and sufficient conditions that include 100% of apples and exclude all other objects. And we'll spend a good 20 minutes in class with a class of 30 people thinking together, and it turns out they can't define apple. But that doesn't mean that if I say, hey, grab me an apple, they're going to bring me a fish or a chair or something like that. They absolutely know what apples are. The idea that you have to be able to provide a crisp analytic definition in order to use a word properly, in order to have meaning for a word, and in order to understand it, that's just false. As Wittgenstein called it, philosopher's nonsense. And I think he's right about that. That's just not the way language works.
I was beginning in a more naive way to, what are we actually talking about here?
Yeah. And so I do this descriptive thing to provide some extra texture. And so some examples that I provide in the book is like the idea of trans-inclusive feminism. So people across the spectrum, whether you're left, right, center, anywhere in between, if you're someone who just rejects feminism, people would understand you to be not woke. No one would say of someone who explicitly rejects feminism, wow, that person's woke. And then similarly, if you have an approach to feminism that is trans-exclusionary, basically no one would understand that person to be woke. J.K. Rowling is an example of someone who self-describes as a feminist, but is also understands feminism in a trans exclusionary way, and people across the spectrum pretty much are in agreement that J.K. Rowling is not woke. In fact, if anything, they increasingly code her as a right-wing reactionary or something for rejecting this premise. And so the book walks through a number of these things to provide some texture for what people seem to be talking about when they talk about wokeness, that people across the spectrum can agree on. But one of the things that I don't think they cohere into a definition or a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. I don't think they need to, again. But one thing that's striking and important about the set of thoughts and practices and modes of engagement that are associated with wokeness, that are associated with the term woke, is that they tend to prevail almost exclusively among people who are highly educated and relatively affluent people, especially people who are tied to the knowledge profession. So, woke discourses aren't the dominant discourses of the trailer park, the global slum, and things like this. They're ways of talking and thinking that are nearly exclusively unique to the knowledge professions.
But it's not only the trailer park and the global slum, it's also the suburbs. I mean, it's not just poor people we're talking about here.
Yeah. And so, if you go to the hollowed out suburbs, which increasingly in America, actually, poor people are living in, are concentrated in suburbs, and affluent, educated people have concentrated themselves in urban cores. But you go to these kind of hollowed out suburbs where less affluent people are living and stuff like that. This isn't the way those people talk or think about anything. It's highly educated, relatively affluent people who tend to adopt these discourses, and so that was that's one thing that's striking to me, and another thing that's important, and one of the cultural contradictions the book explores, is that when you look at how these discourses are used, one of the ways that they're increasingly used in practice is that they allow the winners in the knowledge economy, the winners in the prevailing order, to point at the people who are falling behind and suffering and losing, and say that those people deserve their suffering, they deserve their loss, they deserve their marginalization. Because
they're prejudiced and chauvinistic and stupid.
Yes, absolutely. So white privilege is a great example. So there's kind of, as I show in the book, there's one problem with white privilege is that it assumes that all white people benefit in the same way from their race, and context doesn't matter. And that's just not true. But I'll bracket that point. A bigger issue with the discourse is that it turns out when you look at poor people in America, a plurality of poor people in America are white. And when you look at the empirical, they've done empirical testing about white privilege training, and it turns out the main effect of this training, it doesn't cause people to think any differently about non-white people than they did before. It doesn't cause them to treat non-white people any differently than they did before. The main effect of teaching people about white privilege is it leads people to think even more poorly about poor whites than they already did. The assumption is, oh, you were born with all this privilege and you're poor? Well, you must really deserve it. You must really be terrible about making decisions and things like this. And so, the lion's share of poor people in America are white. And so if you subscribe to an ideology that allows you to write off the suffering of a plurality of poor people, to say that you don't owe them anything, you don't need to redistribute anything to them, in fact, they probably have more than they deserve still, that's a very convenient view for elites to hold, right?
It reminds me of something, Musa. It reminds me of Calvinism, which was so important also for capitalism, and which also, of course, came over with Protestant sects to the United States. And this Calvinist idea that, there's predestination, therefore the saved are already saved, and God shows his pleasure with them by making them rich, and shows his displeasure with others by letting them be poor. And that is this very strong moral component, and we all deserve our lot. And no, I haven't fallen upwards here because I've been indecently lucky, but look, I've actually worked for this. And the others, they could just roll up their sleeves and do some decent work, and then they would get somewhere anyway. And if they don't, they're simply inferior.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's striking is that most knowledge economy professionals do apply that thinking, but selectively, especially white. I'll say some white knowledge economy professionals apply this logic selectively to say poor whites. This is true, but for non-whites, it must be prejudice and discrimination. But one thing that's interesting is that non-whites actually tend to apply this principle more consistently across the board. So I have a colleague of mine, Azim Sharif, who looked at people who were non-white and experienced upward social mobility. And what you might think is that those folks would be more empathetic towards other people who were also from historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups who are still in kind of poor positions and so on. But he finds that's not the case. They're actually less sympathetic than other people because they assume, hey, look, I managed to make it out. I experienced this upward mobility. I was in the same position as you. If you're still there, it must be because of something that you did, some fault about you, and so on and so forth. And so, for non-white, relatively affluent, highly educated people, they tend to apply this kind of Calvinist logic, pretty symmetrically across the board. For white people who are in these positions, they tend to apply it in a kind of selective way. When they look at poor whites, they assume that they tell this kind of discourse, but when they analyze the fates of non-white people, they analyze them through a different framework altogether, one of prejudice.
Through a framework of race. And now, tell me, you're operating with one very interesting term that I feel could grow wings and have a beautiful career. You talk about symbolic capitalism. Now, a lot of people know what capitalism is and have various thoughts about it. What is symbolic capitalism?
So this is a term that I cribbed from a different sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, symbolic capital. And so on Bourdieu's conception, symbolic capital was the resources that elites drew on to make unequal states of affairs seem kind of normal or appropriate or natural. And so he had kind of three versions of this. There's kind of academic capital, which is when you get other people to defer to you, to do what you want, to trust you based on your credentials or your association with knowledge economy institutions. So I write for the New York Times, or I have a PhD in cultural anthropology, or I am a professor at Harvard University or something like that. And then there's political capital, which is when you get people to defer to you, to follow your lead, because you've convinced them that it's in their interest to do so, either because of the position you hold in an organization, such as you should do what I say because I'm the manager, and if you don't, I'm going to write you up or fire you, or because of you've cultivated a reputation of someone who knows what they're doing and gets things done, and so on and so forth. And then finally, there's cultural capital, which is when people defer to you, follow your lead, try to make you happy because they think you're interesting and sophisticated and cool, and they want you to like them, or they want to emulate you, or they want to please you and make you happy for this reason because they. And so Bourdieu argued collectively these different forms of symbolic capital help mark people as people who are worth listening to, as people who are worth ignoring, as people who are whose perspectives are valuable and important, as people who are geniuses or people who are hacks, and so on and so forth. And so in the book, I described this constellation of knowledge economy professionals as symbolic capitalists, in part because when you look at like how we make a living, it's basically by what we know, who we know, and how we're known. That is, we make a living by producing and manipulating symbolic capital on behalf of ourselves and other people.
What do you mean by symbolic capital? Is that the same as cultural capital? I mean, you're describing these knowledge economy professionals, and we can all imagine who they are at universities, in the media, etc. What is this symbolic capital that they're handling?
Yeah. So cultural capital is part of it, but symbolic capital is kind of a more inclusive a term that includes cultural capital, political capital, and academic capital, basically. But yeah, it's so what we're manipulating are these perceptions that we are people that you should listen to and defer to and trust because it's in your interest to do so, or because of our deep knowledge and skills and our specialized knowledge, and because of our and things like this, and because of our sophistication and things. One of the interesting things about these professions, about the knowledge professions, is that from the beginning of a lot of these fields, so we tend to make more money than other people. We have a lot more autonomy than other people. We have a lot more prestige than other workers. And from the beginning of these fields, we've said the reason you should give us these things is not for our own sake, not to benefit us, but because if you give us this power, this pay, this prestige, it will be to the benefit of everyone in society, including and especially the most vulnerable among us, the marginalized and the disadvantaged. And a lot of our fields were literally created under the auspices of altruism and serving the common good. So my own fields, journalists are supposed to speak truth to power and be a voice for the voiceless. And academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to tell the truth without regards to anyone else's political interests or economic interests, and so on and so forth. And so the fact that from the beginning of our professions, we've kind of justified our status, our power, our influence in terms of these altruistic narratives, created a unique form of status competition within the symbolic professions, where to the extent that we are seen as being as embodying the right beliefs and values, or as being especially good at advancing the interests of the common good or the genuinely marginalized and disadvantaged and so on, we're seen as especially worthy of status and power and influence and so on. And to the extent that we're successfully portrayed as holding the wrong beliefs about the wrong people, or having the wrong motives, or the wrong interests or alliances, or things like this, then we can find our position in these professions precarious, or we can even lose our jobs. And this has been true now for a century. Again, this isn't something that started with Twitter. This has been true for a century. And one of the things I explore in the book is that after the 1960s, the symbolic professions were diversified. So a lot of these jobs initially, when they were created as sinecures, basically, for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of relatively affluent backgrounds, like unashamedly excluded everyone else. They weren't shy about it or anything like this. But then after the 1960s, this became untenable, both because of changes in law and things like this. And so you had growing numbers of women and non-white people and so on getting folded into these professions. And this actually kind of changed the nature of status competition in an interesting way, because you had increasing numbers of people who could not only claim to be advocates or allies for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, but could literally claim to directly represent the marginalized and the disadvantaged, to embody, right, the kind of prejudice and discrimination and the social problems that we're trying to solve. And so this created an arms race in the symbolic professions, where you had growing numbers of elites who were bending over backwards to find ways to identify themselves as being marginalized or disadvantaged, not just being allies and advocates of those people, and so people who aren't racial and ethnic minorities are increasingly finding ways to define themselves as queer or neurodivergent or disabled or things like this.
You make a very interesting point here, and for people who have been listening to this podcast for a while, they know that I am slightly obsessed with the crisis of the liberal project, by which I don't mean liberal parties, but the sort of enlightenment-based project of emancipation. I think that is in crisis, and I think we have brought it into that crisis. I don't think it happened. I think it was a creation, and you're shining a light on a very interesting aspect of which you so charmingly call elite overproduction. In other words, yes, higher education has worked great. There are now so far more people than we would actually need to fill these jobs that they need to find ways of getting at each other. They need to find ways of distinguishing themselves that are not just academic excellence, because that's not enough. There's simply too many people who can write dissertations and articles and run research projects and other things, so you need to have an extra perk, an extra characteristic that lifts you out of the crowd, and here wokeness comes in.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, as you said, this is one of the... in fact, one of the, as I show in the book, when you look at the predictors of when these periods of awakening happen, they happen. Especially, they're especially likely to occur. In fact, they pretty much exclusively occur during these periods of where elite overproduction becomes really acute. So when we're producing a lot more people who have a reasonable expectation to be elites, then we have capacities to give them the elite lifestyles that they expect. And when people find themselves, when growing numbers of people find themselves in this position, what they tend to do is kind of indict the prevailing order and the people who are who are running the show, and try to tear down some existing elites to make room for themselves. And in these moments when the struggle over jobs and resources and status becomes especially intense, those are the moments where, as you said, we lean especially hard into some of these moral and political discourses, instead of focusing on our credentials or what we can add to the organization and so on and so forth.
It reminds me a bit of the mechanism that happens in so many revolutions. I'm convinced that every revolution is started by idealists and ended by bandits. And in between, you always have this phase of ideological purity when the non-ideologically pure are eliminated. And there's also this idea, as is in much of woke discourse today, that there's my opinions and then there's a lot of wrong to evil opinions. And there is no nuance of discussion. There is no agreeing to disagree, but there is a strong moral condemnation of any divergent viewpoint.
Yeah, and this actually has two important consequences. One of them is that we often actually create an atmosphere that's hostile for the very people that we're trying to help and include. So, for instance, again, if you look at polls and surveys, the Americans that are least likely, the Americans that are most likely to hold socially conservative and religious views are people who are, for instance, and to subscribe to traditional understandings of society and social roles and so on, are people who are less affluent, people who are of less educated backgrounds, people who are racial and ethnic minorities, who are immigrants, who are religious minorities, and so on. And so if you create an atmosphere that's hostile and intolerant towards socially conservative or religious views, that's not going to alienate and marginalize people from the dominant population. The people of the institutionally dominant population also tend to hold the institutionally dominant view. The reason, and so the people who end up getting excluded and censored and punished and things like this tend to be people who are already vulnerable and underrepresented in these institutions. You can see this, for instance, colleagues of mine, Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Kolev, published a study in Harvard Business Review looking at what happens when companies create anonymous grievance reporting systems. And the idea behind these systems is that they'll help marginalized and disadvantaged people because they don't feel as comfortable going to the authorities. They don't know how the systems work, blah, blah, blah. So if you give them these kind of grievance procedures, it will help redress harm and so on. But it turns out when you create these grievance procedures, these anonymous reporting systems and so on, there's absolutely zero impact at all on white male managers in terms of getting written up or fired or promoted or demoted or anything like that. There's a small negative impact on white female managers, a larger negative impact on non-white female managers, and a huge negative impact on non-white male managers. They tend to get fired, demoted, punished at much higher levels. And so actually management becomes less diverse when you implement these procedures. And the reason this happens is actually kind of obvious. It's counterintuitive at first, but it's kind of obvious when you think about it. And that's that if you make it easier for people to punish and police anyone who says and thinks the wrong thing at the wrong time, well, guess who's really good at knowing what the right thing to say is at the right time and stuff like that? People who are in these professional spaces. Well, that would be people who are from relatively affluent backgrounds, people who share the dominant culture, who grew up in the dominant culture, and so on. People who had kind of unusual journeys to get into these elite spaces, who are non-traditional members of this new elite constellation, are going to be much more likely to say the wrong thing at the wrong time, or to say the right thing in the wrong way, and so on and so forth. And so if you make it easier to discipline and punish people for any deviance, the people who are going to be disciplined and punished are going to be non-white people, people from non-traditional backgrounds, people from less affluent backgrounds, and so on. And we can see that happening empirically when these things are put into place. And so in the name of diversity and inclusion, we often create spaces that are hostile towards non-traditional people and diverse people from underrepresented and historically marginalized backgrounds. And so that's one consequence of this intolerance, is we actually make our spaces less inclusive and diverse. And then another consequence is that we often generate blowback against us and our institutions. So as I show in the book, one of the consequences that happens after basically every single one of these awakenings is they're followed by backlash and right-leaning gains at the ballot box.
We've just experienced one such backlash. Musa, you also say that this is really the clinching argument in your book, and a very important moment, I think, that this woke competition for status, perhaps also for being part of the right minority, is basically a game that happens within these circles of relatively affluent, educated professionals. But though the rhetoric is one of social solidarity, of protecting minorities, of giving people chances, of emancipating them, actually none of this helps the people that are supposed to be addressed. Is that a fair summary of your argument?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at across these different awakenings.
By the way, when you say the different awakenings, which other historical examples would you name?
So the first awakening was in the 20s through the early 30s. The second one was in the mid 60s through the early 70s. The third one was in the late 80s to the early 90s, which was the last time that we had these big blowups around what they called PC culture at the time, but today we call wokeness. And then the most recent one starts after 2010. And as I show in the book, and the nice thing about having this comparative thing, and I showed looking at the same measures that you can use to quantify that something actually did shift after 2010. It's not a moral panic. It's not about vibes. Like you can measure empirically that there were these set of changes. Using these same kind of measures, we can see that, again, there were these previous episodes. And comparing and contrasting them gives us leverage on questions like, well, why do these awakenings come about? Do they change anything? What do they change? And so on this point, what I argue in the book is that there's basically not a relationship at all between actual progress, especially for people who are genuinely disadvantaged and marginalized in society, and these awakenings. There's just no relationship. There's basically no systematic change in laws, no change in reallocations of resources, no changes in almost all the reforms that occur within the symbolic professions themselves. And so that can benefit if you're someone who already, like, so for instance, the corporate boards for places like, for firms like Goldman Sachs are more diverse now than they were at the beginning of the awakening, which is, you can tell a story about how that's, racial justice resonant or whatever, but there's basically no way in which that benefits ordinary people at all. It doesn't change the lives of anyone who's black or poor or anything like that. because there's a black person who's on the board of Goldman Sachs where before it was a white person. I mean, that's good for that specific black person. But that doesn't, in part because in order to even be considered for a position on the board of Goldman Sachs, you have to basically have graduated from an Ivy League school, probably with an advanced degree, and then succeeded at getting a job at one of the top elite firms after your graduation and so on, in order to even be in the pool of people who are competitive. So if they make it easier for diverse people to join corporate boards and so on and so forth, that basically doesn't matter at all to the vast majority of Americans. There's basically no way in which that changes or improves their lives, unless you assume that having a black person on the board of Goldman Sachs, that they'll make significantly different decisions and so on. But the thing about it is, again, in order to jump through all these gatekeeping steps and stuff, there's this long process of enculturation where you have to, in fact, the kind of reductio ad absurdum of the idea that if you just put non-white people or women or whoever into these positions of power, it will change how they operate, would be to look at the Columbia protests and their aftermath. So President Shafiq, who oversaw Columbia University, was the first female of Arab or Muslim background. And so according to the kind of banal identitarian logic, that one would assume that she would be especially sympathetic or tolerant or whatever of these kinds of demonstrations and would handle them with more care and finesse and so on than other leaders might. Instead, she presided over one of the most aggressive crackdowns against protests that has happened in generations. And this is in part because, of course, President Shafiq was more than just a woman of Arab ancestry. She was also a literal baroness. She previously worked for the World Bank and she was presiding over Columbia University, which is an institution that serves a very specific set of social functions in society, one of them being, probably the main one being, that it helps mark people as being worth listening to or not. It helps mark people as elites and so on and so forth. Which is to say, Columbia University is an institution that in a deep sense exists in part to reproduce and legitimize inequalities, to help mark out people who deserve to be elites and to explain why those people deserve to be elites because of their merits, because they got a degree from Columbia, one of the top schools. And so I saw this myself in my own life. Before I was at Columbia University, I would pitch articles to like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I wouldn't even get a no. I was below rejection. And then I got a job. And then when I started working and studying at Columbia, I had editors from the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on reach out to me cold. Hey, I'm an editor at the New York Times. Would you like to write for us about blah? And this wasn't because I became a better writer in the time it took to move from Sierra Vista, Arizona to the Upper West Side of Manhattan. That is 100% institutional effects and network effects and things like that. It's because I became associated with Columbia. All of a sudden, I became a person worth listening to, when before I was writing the same kinds of essays, and I was not worth listening to because I was not at Columbia. Last thing I'll say on this. There's a great essay by someone, by a cultural critic, Bertrand Cooper, called Who Gets to Create Black Culture? And his argument here, one of the things he says that like haunts me, is that if after George Floyd was killed, there were, any media organization you can imagine, all the entertainment, like specials about George Floyd and his life, articles about George Floyd. And Cooper points out that if George Floyd hadn't been killed, but he wanted to write an essay for the New York Times or the Washington Post or produce something for HBO, they would have never considered him, not for 1 second. They would have gone straight to the trash bin. It would have been like me, not even worth rejection. There's zero chance that a living George Floyd could have published anything in the New York Times and the Washington Post and anything like that. Because the truth is, outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post don't give one whit for the perspectives and priorities of people like George Floyd. People like George Floyd are completely invisible in these outlets. We don't care about what they think. We don't know what they think. And in fact, when we're confronted with what they think, we often respond negatively. So there was a reporter for The Intercept, Lee Fang, who during the George Floyd protests, went out and just interviewed Black people about what they thought about Black Lives Matter. And it turned out that a lot of Black people didn't like Black Lives Matter. They thought that the protests were not effective, that the organization was corrupt, that the organization stood for things that were not what they stood for, and so on and so forth. And so Fang produced a short documentary that aired a lot of a diverse range of perspectives of Black people about Black Lives Matter, and he was fired from The Intercept because for the crime of showing progressive, highly educated people that a lot of Black people don't like Black Lives Matter. He was fired for that. So not only do we not include the perspectives of people like George Floyd or care about them, not only is it true that someone like George Floyd could never even write for these outlets that spilled immense amounts, unending amounts of ink celebrating his life after he became a victim of state violence and became useful in our power struggles. Not only is it the case that we don't care about people like George Floyd unless we can use him in our power struggles because he became a victim of state violence and therefore another symbol for us to manipulate. But even when we are confronted with the perspectives of those people, we often recoil in anger and horror and punish the messenger who presented us with the perspectives of these ordinary people.
Musa Al-Gharbi, it's fascinating to listen to you and to talk to you, and I would have many more questions, but I know that you have somewhere else to be. So let me just ask, bring this back to the beginning. We began talking about the Trump vote and about people who are feeling angry and humiliated by a liberal elite that they feel is not only acting with impunity, but is also enriching itself. And on top of that is telling everybody what to think and who they are if they think what they think. And you describe this woke culture. I mean, to me, it always appears such a caricature of very legitimate and urgent interests. And I think this is also worth saying in this conversation. The interests of trans people, the interests of sexually not standard people, etc. The interests of all these minorities need to be taken seriously, and everybody needs to be living in the dignity they deserve, and that is not yet the case, and therefore these are urgent political questions. But they've been basically turned into a political tool, you say, in a fight between liberal professionals, which is not filtering down to any kind of social justice, but has just become a stick to poke your opponent in the eye with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say, again, so at the end of the book, I have a section called Babies in Bathwater, where I emphasize this point. And again, in my own life, my father grew up when segregation was a thing, like actual segregation. He went to segregated schools his whole life. It wasn't until 1973, Adams v. Richardson, because even after Brown v. Board of Education in the United States, colleges were still segregated until 1973. And so until Adams v. Richardson. And so my father, his whole life, all the way up until the time he went to college, he went to segregated schools. Like actual segregation was a thing. And it's still the case. One of the things that you see clearly in the book walks through how a lot of the knowledge economy professions are themselves extremely hierarchical, extremely parochial. The book does a deep dive into systematic inequalities along the lines of gender and race, for instance, within the knowledge professions. Those are very real problems. And I'll say, and one way to understand the project of this book, actually, because a lot of even the work that I do where I'm concerned about viewpoint diversity, like ideological diversity and how it corrupts knowledge production, when I was talking about the red line and the blue line earlier in this conversation, my entry point to these to being sensitive to that issue about how the composition of fields of knowledge shapes the kinds of knowledge that gets produced. My entry point to that series of issues was through queer theory, critical race theory, feminist standpoint epistemology, and critical race theory, post-colonial theory. These were this was my entry point. I didn't become interested in these relationships between power and knowledge because I I I don't know, read something by one of the folks who's kind of popular on the red line, blue line thing today. And so one way to understand what this book is doing actually is it's taking the arguments from these literatures of post-colonial theory, queer theory, critical race theory, feminist standpoint epistemology. It's taking the arguments of these fields to what I view as their logical conclusion, which should lead us to question, to really interrogate and take seriously the possibility that our own ostensibly emancipatory belief systems might not represent the values and interests of the genuinely marginalized and disadvantaged in society. They might be reflecting our own class interest, be a product of our own class interests, and be, advancing our own class interests. There's no reason to think that our own belief systems are.
I love your subtle use of the subjunctive, but they might. They just might. One concluding question, which is, of course, the $64 million question. And that is, what would it take to heal these divided societies and to create one polity again? I don't want to ask you, and what is the role of social media in that, because that is a whole new hour of discussion. But what would it take, or is it possible at all in this situation to begin healing the divide in these societies that makes them so torn apart?
So one thing that I don't do in the book is I kind of, as a spoiler, sorry audience,
I'm sure there are lots of things you don't do in the book, so you're welcome to talk about them.
So one thing that I don't do is I don't provide, usually a book like this would end with it's like 6 chapters describing a problem, and then the conclusion is like, here's my 12 steps to solve it, or something like this. I don't do anything like that. I force readers to just kind of sit with the weight of the problems and the difficulties, and in part because I don't think that there are easy solutions, and in part because if there are convenient solutions, I'm not sure exactly. Like, this is something that I'm thinking about a lot, because I agree, it's like the question, right? It's like, what do we do about this? I have some provisional thoughts about both things that we can do at the macro level and things that symbolic capitalists could do at a more discrete level that could help improve some of this stuff. So, for instance, one of the things that I talk about in the intro to the book, I paint this scene how during COVID and the post-George Floyd protests, there are all these people who were taking part in these protests where they were like shaking signs at cars that said Black Lives Matter, and the cars would honk at the signs, and the people holding the signs would go woo. And one of the things that was striking to me about this scene, as I say in the book, is that often people were shaking these signs, like literally standing over, like walking over homeless Black people who often didn't even have shoes, and the Black people like directly in front of them were invisible, and so on. But we can set that to the side. The bigger issue is that there wasn't really a meaningful correspondence between what it was that the people said they wanted to accomplish and what they were actually doing. There's not really a plausible story about how shaking a sign at a car honking by is going to save anyone's life or get anyone released from prison or anything like that. And so, like, for instance, if I was going to, like, one bit of advice that I would strongly urge people to do is to really look at whether or not there's a correspondence between the things we want to accomplish and the things we're actually doing. And if there's not a correspondence, if there's not a clean correspondence, then we should really ask ourselves, okay, well then who are we doing this for? For instance, in the event of shaking the sign at the passing car, again, we're not doing that for people in jail or for people who are being killed by police, because what we're doing makes absolutely no impact in their lives, and they're not even seeing the demonstration, let alone.
Do you think these kind of demonstrations make any impact on victims of those situations? Don't you think building up an atmosphere, changing a public opinion, intervening in the public space can be something that is part of a bigger initiative to change?
Well, I think that I think one of the ways we go awry actually is that we overestimate the extent to which changing beliefs and attitudes matters, in part because we assume that there's this tight correspondence between beliefs and actions. And so if you change people's beliefs and perceptions, then that will cause them to behave differently. But a kind of reductio ad absurdum proof against that ideology would be to look at our own professions and to look at our own communities. Like the places that symbolic capitalists dominate, almost everyone it's like they're some of the most progressive spaces where almost everyone believes the right things and has the right motives, and much more so than basically anywhere else in society. But they're some of the most parochial places, some of the most parochial institutions in the entire country. They're some of the most hierarchical and exploitative, some of the most unequal communities in the entire country, some of the most racially segregated, and so on and so forth. And we can't blame the Republicans or anyone like that for this, because they're towns and communities and institutions that are controlled nearly exclusively by Democrats, right? So, and so the idea that if we just believe the right things, then we'll do the right things. That's just not quite accurate. And so I think we overinvest in shifting perceptions rather than focusing on mobilizing people to actually do things in the world, and especially to do things that entail us making changes or risks or sacrifices or controlling the things that we can control. And the things that we can control is a lot. So again, and if you look at these knowledge economy hubs, given that Democrats control a lot of these institutions and a lot of these communities with basically one party rule, and there's immense amounts of wealth and stuff like this concentrated in these institutions and in these communities, it's completely within the power of the people. There's not really political opposition for them to overcome. There are no Republicans to speak of dominating, for instance, the New York City Council or the New York State Assembly, or even and so on and so forth. The reason New York looks the way it does, both at the city and the state level, is because of what Democrats are doing. And so if we make better use of, if we leverage the things that are actually within our control, it is within our capacities to radically upend the distribution of wealth and opportunity in this country, if we just, given how much is actually within our hands to control. Again, with no Republican opposition, and institutions that are almost uniformly blue. Academia, Democrats outnumber Republicans by 5-1, and in a lot of fields, it's 10-1, right? We can't point to Republicans or conservatives or wrong-thinking people to explain why institutions of higher learning function the way they do and look the way they do. The people who are making the stuff happen are almost exclusively Democrats, almost exclusively liberals, almost exclusively people who are in principle committed to diversity and inclusion, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, I think focusing more on action and behaviors and allocations of resources and things like this, instead of hearts and minds, is an important component to making progress on a lot of these issues.
Musa Al-Gharbi, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. Thank you for giving us this time. And go out and buy Musa Al-Gharbi's book, We Have Never Been Woke, which you see standing behind him on the left with a big black dot on. This was it for this episode of the Blomcast. Go out and spread the word. Talk to all your friends and relations about Musa's book, and indeed about the Blomcast, which you can like, subscribe to, write comments about, and I will even answer you if you ask me something. So please do. You're also welcome to suggest other guests. But for this week, that's all. Thank you very much.